Okay, please welcome Esther.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. I feel like the energy in the room is a bit down. So, hi, everyone. Awesome. So, it's a pleasure to be here. And yeah, I hope you've been having an amazing conference so far. Yeah? Okay, so my talk is just about 15 minutes. So, please give me 15 minutes of your time. I really need you to give me the energy, and I'll be out of your face. So it's a pleasure to be here to speak about a modern approach to CSS-in-JS. My name is Esther Agbaje, and I work as a developer advocate at Chakra. You find me creating content on developer education, web development, and everything getting remote tech jobs. I'm also an open source advocate. I contribute to open source projects like Chakra UI. All right, so enough about me. Before we jump into today's talk, I would like to get a feel of the room regarding CSS-in-JS. So a quick show of hands if you genuinely do not like CSS-in-JS. And you're like, nah, this is not for me. Quick show of hands. Okay, that's not too bad. That's a bit encouraging for me. How about if you're fine with any styling solution, CSS-in-JS, atomic classes, whatever, you're good to go, anything that gets the job done. Okay, that's much better. And finally, those that are pro CSS-in-JS, you use CSS-in-JS for anything and everything, and your teammates have to use it with you. Yay! All right, so whichever category of folks you are, I'm happy you're on my talk. And the first thing I would like to say is CSS-in-JS is not a replacement for CSS. There's a lot of misconception, and folks think that CSS-in-JS is trying to replace CSS. In reality, CSS-in-JS is not a replacement for CSS. All we are trying to do is a way to make CSS more powerful and more flexible. So why is this even a thing, right? Why do we need to write our styles in our JavaScript code? CSS-in-JS brings many benefits, and one of these is co-location. And by co-location, I mean your styles and your components are in the same file. And this way, you no longer need to shuffle back and forth. It's easy to manage. Everything is in one place. Another benefit of CSS-in-JS is the fact that it gives us scope styles. And by scope styles, we no longer need to worry about class naming conflicts, which is really amazing. CSS-in-JS also gives us dynamic styles and type safety right out of the box. And personally, I love it because it just gives me excellent developer experience when I'm building applications. So let's take a step back to look at how CSS-in-JS has come over time. The very first CSS-in-JS library launched in 2014. It was called GSS. And after this, we've had the likes of Fella, styled components that launched in 2016, Stitches, and a lot more. Now with GSS, the styling API looked pretty much like this. We have a function that writes styles for us, and then we're able to map this style into a class name. Now, styled components came and changed the whole API game by allowing us to actually create components while writing our styles. So here's how the API for styled components looked like. And then Stitches came using the styled components API, but it took it to a whole new level by allowing us to create different variations of a single component. So this way, we are no longer creating one component. In many cases, a component, we have different variations, right? So we are able to then create different variations of a single component, and I think this was really brilliant. So one thing is consistent throughout all the CSS-in-JS libraries. We see that we are pushing the boundaries of CSS-in-JS. This tells us that CSS in JS is not a trend. It's actually a way of rethinking how we write styles that are modular, more accessible, and more scalable over time. Now, when people think about CSS in JS, they think about it from the runtime perspective. Runtime CSS in JS is actually one approach to CSS in JS. So let's take a look at what happens during runtime CSS in JS. The first thing, after specifying your styles, which is what you see on the left of your screen, two things actually happen. The first thing is a class name is generated on that element, which is what we see here on the H1. And next, the second thing, CSS is actually injected into the browser when the page loads. And because of this, CSS in JS has gotten a poor reputation for bad performance. A lot of developers are like, nah, I don't want to use it because it doesn't work really well. And with the launch of React Server components, this even makes things worse, right? A lot more folks are moving away from CSS in JS because of the poor performance. But the good news is things are changing. CSS in JS is moving from runtime to build time. CSS in JS is going from dynamic to static extraction. Now, for CSS in JS to work in a constantly evolving ecosystem, a lot of things are happening every single day in web development. Modern CSS in JS should embrace certain features. And the first of this is it should use the new CSS features like container queries, cascade layers, color mix, and a whole lot of what we see on the screen. So as CSS is evolving, CSS in JS should also evolve as it goes. Another thing that CSS in JS should have is the support for design token. And by design tokens, developers are able to define their styles in a single place and use these styles as tokens throughout their applications and components. CSS in JS should also support type safety for design tokens. And this is especially useful for teams that have design systems, so that anyone on your team that is writing styles and just uses a style that is not defined as a token, you immediately get an error. So you can see a red squiggly line on the font weight and the color property because someone is using a token that is not specified. Whereas with CSS in JS, you get type safety. You can set type safety for your tokens. And when you use tokens that are specified, everything looks really good. And this is what we want in our teams. Now, earlier I talked about the fact that CSS in JS is moving from runtime to build time and is going to static extraction. So static extraction is really where styles are extracted into a separate style sheet at build time. So this way, JavaScript no longer needs to evaluate these styles when the page loads. The styles are immediately accessible, right? And this is so useful. This means that when we write CSS in JS using the static extraction approach, we're able to get the developer experience from CSS in JS, and we're also able to get the atomic classes, which is what we get in terms of the output when writing regular CSS. So this way, we're able to combine the best of both worlds. So here's a CSS in JS library that I would like to talk about, Panda CSS. So Panda CSS is a build-time CSS in JS library that combines all the features of modern CSS in JS that we've looked at, right? And one of the things that makes Panda CSS stand out is the fact that it's not constrained or restricted to a single library or a single framework. It's framework agnostic, meaning that it works in any JavaScript library or any framework. And for me, this is one of the things that really make Panda CSS awesome. So the baseline when using Panda CSS is to write styles with a CSS function. Now, when we write styles with the CSS function, we can either use the object syntax or the template literal syntax. And when we write our styles, it just gets transformed to atomic CSS and atomic classes with post CSS. And the benefit of having atomic class names is that your style sheets get flattened over time, and there's no duplicated styles even when your project grows. So Panda CSS comes with a rich set of features, and today I'll be highlighting 3 features that make Panda CSS really helpful for me as a developer, and I think it will be helpful to you as well. These are features that developers will love. So the first of this is patterns. So think of patterns as shortcuts to avoid repeating specific layout styles like flex, grid, and a whole lot more. So Panda CSS comes with its own set of defined patterns like H-stack, V-stack, and the great part of this is that you can actually create your own custom CSS pattern. Now to use patterns, here is a profile card at the top right corner, and it's a common card that we see in our day-to-day. So for us to use Panda CSS patterns to actually create this profile card, the first thing we want to do is to import the patterns that we need. So here at the top, I'm importing circle for our image, H-stack to lay out the image and the content, the text content, and stack to stack out the text elements. So by H-stack, what we mean is that the elements within it are stacked horizontally, right? And there's a uniform spacing between them. So under the hood, H-stack actually is a flex box. And personally, I love using patterns because they just help me to move faster when developing UIs and applications or components. And the output of this is atomic classes, which is what we see. Now, the next feature of Panda CSS that I really, really love is the concept of recipes. So recipes are predefined styles for different component variations, right? So here's a button component. And the button component, we can see that it's in various variants, if I can say so. So for example, we have the purple color, which is like the primary variant, the green color, which is the secondary variant, and the white color, which is the neutral variant. And a lot of times, we see that buttons are also available in different sizes. So for us to create a recipe for our button, the first thing we need to do is to import the CVA function. So the CVA function is what allows us to create any recipe at all in Panda CSS. And then we are able to define the common or shared styles among all of these variants of a component. And this is what we define in the base key here. The next thing to do when creating a component, in this case a recipe, in this case a button recipe, is to define the specific styles for each variant. So this is defined in the variant key, or the primary key rather. And here we are defining the primary key, or the primary key background color as purple.300. We're also defining the hover background color as purple.400. And similar pattern you follow for any recipe variant that you're defining. And of course, use the recipe after defining it. You're immediately able to use it by passing it into the class name and defining the variant you want to use. And recipes are really a smart way to create dynamic styles of the same component. Now, style props in Panda CSS are a way to actually write styles by passing props to your components. And here is the profile card that we saw earlier using patterns. And we're able to create this profile card using components. So I'm using an H-stack component. And if you're wondering, yeah, all the patterns in Panda CSS also have their equivalent components. And me, I personally love using it because I like writing styles with style props. They just make me move a lot faster. It keeps my code clean, and it keeps it a lot more concise than using functions. And the output, as usual, is atomic classes. So Panda CSS is pushing the boundaries of CSS-in-JS as CSS-in-JS continues to evolve. We have our maintainers, we have our contributors, and we are also open to more contributors and maintainers. If any of the features I've talked about here really excite you, please feel free to check out Panda CSS. And yeah, thank you for coming to my talk, and enjoy the rest of the conference.